G'day, and welcome to the AOS Coach sneak peek into the 2022 Idoneth Deepkin Battletome. Now, Games Workshop were kind enough to send this to me in advance. However, they have not seen any of the video in preparation to going to YouTube, nor am I under any obligation to do this review. In this video, I'm going to focus on the Idoneth Deepkin Allegiance abilities, and I'm going to share with you some of the initial observations that I have noticed with a match play focus. And to avoid this video being too long, I've separated the video into two parts, and there will be a separate video that focuses on the key War Scroll changes, new battle tactics, new grand strategies. There are unfortunately no battalions, so I'll let you know this in advance. There are no new battalions, but otherwise we'll go through that in a separate video. But in this video, which is a lot about the allegiance abilities, you will find also a heap of cool art. You'll see some narrative gems. You'll see path to glory rules. You'll see a very detailed map of Hish, the Umetrican geo settlement. And you'll also get a unique code that you can use in the AOS app. Idoneth Deepkin continue to enjoy the Tides of Death allegiance abilities, along with a few extras like the Forgotten Nightmares, the Ishran rituals, as well as the sub-factions. However, I want you to hold your seahorses, folks. We will get to the Tides of Death in a moment. The Ishran rituals also have changed, but there's a lot of commonality there. You have retained your 6 sub-factions, those enclaves, to help you build the specialized forces, and I will share with you what the enclaves look like very, very shortly. Now, speaking about those Ishran rituals, you have gained an initial set of Ishran rituals that I, to be honest with you, forgot you had, until I remembered that this is that jerk move that would stop me from flying. So I looked it through, and the rules have certainly changed. There is no D6 requirement. I remember you used to have to roll 2d6 to I think beat a bravery test, or however the old shenanigans used to be. That option no longer exists. But the way that the Ishran rituals now work without that dice roll is that in the first battle round, after the players have received their initial command points, but before the game has really kicked into the first turn, each of your Ishran units will get to pick one of the following Ishran rituals that will influence the Ether Sea during the battle. So you'll notice that the rituals are more about buffing yourself as opposed to debuffing your opponent. As I mentioned, you used to be able to shut off flying as an example. So the 4 key options that you have through your Ishran rituals. So you can make friendly Idoneth Deepkin units that are affected by the low tide to be able to not be picked for a shooting attack. So your opponent can't shoot you unless you are within 12 inches of that unit. So a great little way to kind of handle the shooting meta we're currently in. You could add +1 to the run rolls and +1 to the charge rolls for friendly Idoneth Deepkin units that are affected by the Flood Tide ability. You could provide friendly Namadi units that have been affected by the High Tide ability to have a 5-up ward. Or before the Idoneth Deepkin unit is affected by the Ebb Tide's ability to retreat, you can roll the dice for each unit within 3 inches of it, and on a 4+, that enemy unit's going to suffer D3. So you can see here they're all tied into the Tides of Battle. It's really about affecting that. And, you know, I previously mentioned the current meta is featuring a lot of long-range shooting threats at the moment. Your Stormcast Eternals, your Daughters of Cain, your Lumineth, your Cruel Boys, just to name a couple. So, you know, things like the Rituals of the Creeping Mist, that's going to deny shooting outside of 12 inches during the low tide would certainly be a great choice currently if I was going to a tournament. But hey, you can obviously always choose before the game starts. But having a Ishran model is potentially going to be quite handy to tap into these rules. Good news is that the Forgotten Nightmare rules have really stayed, and they're relatively the same. The friendly Idoneth Deepkin units can only be picked for a target for shooting as long as they are the closest eligible target to be shot at. So that really gets you to think about protecting your heroes, because you don't have to worry about being the most eligible target. You could be screening with Namadi Reavers, you could going out with some eels, you could be going for some other target that would draw those attacks first and probably better positioned than being sniped. Although it still doesn't change any magical or prayer attacks. It is only really for those shooting attacks. Now, I know what you've been waiting for, and you've wanted to see the Tides of Death, and I know a few Deepkin players have been a little bit nervous on what this is going to look like, and it's good news for you Siege Dwellers because it is the same. Round 1 is going to provide your Idoneth Deepkin troops to get that +1 to the save as if they were in cover. Your Battle Round 2 is going to let units run and still shoot or charge. Round 3 is going to provide those units with that Strike First ability. Round 4 is going to give you the retreat and still shoot or charge. And then round 5 takes you back to being treated as if you were in cover. And I'm sure there is a sigh of relief because, you know, the Tides of Death ability has really helped you stay competitive since day one. And what I really like about it as a Deepkin player or aspiring Deepkin player would be that I can really think about the ways that I want to use my army and plan out my attack, plan out the sequence that I use my battle tactics, maybe which objectives I want to score, which heroes I want to take down, using things like the strike first or the retreat and charge or the, you know, the run and charge. So lots of great flexibility through the Tides of Death. There are 6 sub-factions that are quite rich when it comes to the choices, and you will start to see which of those sub-factions will also unlock battle line choices. Without this being story time with the coach reading his heavy text, here is the summary, but feel free to pause this video and look at the actual text yourself. Futharn is going to unlock the Bloodthirsty Shiver, which is a unique unit to Futharn only, and it is a unit of 3 individual Alapexes, so it will count to your battle line. We'll talk a bit more about the Bloodthirsty Shiver in a minute, but the rule that you get if you do take the Bloodthirsty Shiver is that you get exploding 6s to hit. So if you roll an unmodified 6 to hit, and there are 2 of these Bloodthirsty Shiver models within 3 inches of each other, each 6 that you roll will turn into 2 hits. Obviously, you would then go through the sequence of to wound and all the save and all that stuff, right? But if you happen to have all 3 of the Bloodthirsty Shiver next to each other, again within 3 inches, if you have all 3 of them, that unmodified 6 to hit would actually create 3 hits. So obviously you continue the wound sequence, but you know, it could be quite tasty when you look at the amount of attacks. You roll a bunch of 6s, all 3 of them are with each other. It could be a lot of hits. Dom Hain is going to interact with going first or going second in the battle round. Should you take the top of the battle round, so you go first in that particular battle round, your Normati can charge and fight for a second time in the combat phase if there are no enemy units within 3 inches after they've fought. So they've got to have fought for the first time. If they can delete and clear that unit that they were fighting, they would then be able to then charge and fight again a second time. So that's if you go first. If you go second at the bottom of the battle round, then if you issue the redeploy command ability, instead of getting one unit that can redeploy, you'd be allowed up to 3 Nomada units to redeploy for the use of 1 command point. So very efficient way to be moving around your bodies, trying to avoid charges should you go second in the battle round. And obviously that will change, you know, every round that you go in. Iron Rack is going to give you a new heroic action to choose from over heroic leadership, finest hour, etc., etc. If you do choose this heroic action, you get to pick 1 friendly Achillean unit that is wholly within 12 inches, and that unit can either use the Flood Tide or the Ebb Tide unit ability on top of whatever it was already getting from the Tides of Death. So you would actually get 2 sets of abilities by either tapping into Flood Tide or Ebb Tide and whatever you're on. So also, if you hadn't noticed with the Iron Rack no longer boosts Gotrek. So if you were a Ginger Ninja fan and you love your Gotrek, the old book would boost it because it was an ally or a friendly focused kind of ability. That's completely gone. So sorry, Gotrek, not sorry. Bromdar will let you set up a 3rd unit to join the Soul Scryer instead of 2. So if you were going to be using the Soul Scryer to put some units into reserve, you'd be able to put a 3rd unit in reserve, where normally a Soul Scryer would only allow 2 units plus the Soul Scryer. The other benefit to the Soul Scryer is that it's going to extend the range of where those units can be set up. So normally your Soul Scryer would have to come on from the side of the board, outside of 9 inches from an enemy, and the units that go with the Soul Scryer would have to be set up wholly within 9 inches. Now, with the Bromda ability, it would mean that you can set up your units wholly within 12 inches, still outside of 9 of enemies, but it gives you that extra 3-inch kind of aura around the Soul Scryer to put more bodies down, especially could be quite helpful if you're going to try to use Reavers or Thralls that probably need more space, or you do want to take an extra set of Eels. Now, the Morphan Soul Render is going to be able to bring back 3 additional Nomadi when it uses the Lure Light. And the Notula is going to boost the Leviatons with a new monstrous rampage called Crushing Assault. If you do use the Crushing Assault monstrous rampage, the Leviatons' massive scythed fins and crushing jaw attacks are going to count to be Ren 3, as opposed to, I think, one of them is Ren 1, one of them is Ren 2. So getting some extra Ren is not going to be a bad thing. Also, if I've butchered any of these sub-allegiance names, I do apologize. Now, your Nomadi Reavers and your Nomadi Thralls are going to be your generic Battleline options across the faction. And your Leviatons, your Alapexes, your Morsar Guard, and your Ishalan Guard can all be unlocked as Battleline choices, as well as what I previously mentioned, that Bloodthirsty Shiver, which is unique to the Futharn. Now, let's unpack this new unit a little further. The Bloodthirsty Shiver is a group of 3 individual Alapexes that must be purchased as a group, but will act independently and are treated as separate units. If you take the Bloodthirsty Shiver, it would complete all 3 of your battle line choices in a 2,000 point battle, because again, all 3 of them are individual, and the points value works out to be the same price as if you were taking individual Alapexes. So there is no discount by taking a group of 3, but obviously, you know, by not taking the group of 3, you would lose the Futharn sub-faction rules. Now, it does state on the points in the notes page that they are singles, so it means that you can't reinforce them. But you obviously could take the Bloodthirsty Shiver. If you wanted 2 sets of them, you wanted 6 sharks running around, you could absolutely take 2 sets. They're not unique in that way, but they couldn't be reinforced. If you're like me and you've been dreaming of green stuffing bandanas on 4 Leviatons and running around the AOS Ninja Turtles, you're going to love the fact that you can take Leviatons as battle line until you realize that Donatello can't join the Turtles and he's going to have to stay in the Turtle Van because the points are a little bit too expensive to run 4 Leviatons plus a hero. Your Eel builds, both your Morsar Guard and your Ishalan Guard, are still as good as they always were. You already know how to use them as battle line. I'm not going to talk about more about them. And, you know, obviously, if you take the Achillean as your general, Achillean King specifically, you would be able to unlock those eels no matter which sub-faction you're in. Achillean, Ishran, and Eidolon heroes are all going to get access to 3 different command traits, which is rather exciting. Now, you can obviously read on the screen all the different options. I'll pick out some of my favorite. I really like the Achillean's Unstoppable Fury trait, and that is going to give you +2 attacks for each enemy unit that is within 3 inches, while the Achillean is in the high tide. So, you know, get it in the middle of a couple of units and you're going to get extra attacks, which is great ability. If you did love the old Tidecaster's ability and flipping the tide, I'm sure when we went through the Tides of Death, you were wondering, can I flip the tides? You'll want to take the teaching of the Tusk Coil on your Ishran General, because that old rule is no longer actually on the Tidecaster. So when we get to the other video and we go through some of the key changes, the flipping of the tide isn't on the War Scroll. I believe this is the only way you can flip the tide, so you'll want this command trait. You have a whole bunch of great options to choose from if you're going through the Eidolon option, should your Eidolon be your general. There is one that is generic for both of them, both Storm and Sea, and that is the Ancient Pride. That gives your, basically, if your opponent is attacking the Eidolon and it rolls a 1, an unmodified 1 to hit, then that attack sequence is going to end. So, you know, if they had a lot of attacks, especially if it might be, I don't know, a unit that has, you know, 2 or 3 attacks per model, should they just roll 1, then, you know, that attack sequence is over. The one extra one for the Eidolon of the Storm is going to allow the Eidolon to carry out a monstrous rampage, even though the Eidolon isn't a monster, which is a great way to get Titanic Duel or Stomp. The one that I really like, and I think a lot of people have been waiting for a time that the Eidolon of the Sea, the Wizard Eidolon, will actually get its time in the sun. And I think this ability might actually help. And what it does is it gives you an extra spell to cast if it successfully casts a spell that isn't unbound on a 7+. So the Eidolon of the Sea, from memory, has 2 spells. If it casts one of those spells on a 7+ and it's not unbound, then you're going to get you're going to get a 3rd spell to cast. And heaven forbid you get 2 spells off with the Eidolon on a 7+, then it could be a 4-caster, which is rather exciting. You've also got 9 artifacts to choose from, and they are broken down in the same way. 3 going to the Archelion, 3 going into the Ishran, and 3 going into the Eidolon. The Potion of Hate-Filled Frenzy really piques my interest, and that is for the Archelions. And what it does is, in preparation or as you get hit by the high tides with Archelion Hero, once per battle, if you drink the potion, you'll get +1 to hit, +1 to wound, +1 attacks, and +1 to run and charges until the next hero phase. So a lot of stacking in preparation or to hit the high tide. However, when you do sip it, the bearer is going to suffer D3 mortal wounds, and it's not going to be able to pile in the next turn. So there will be some after effects like a hangover. Ishran has some interesting debuff artifacts that could impact wizards. There's another one that impacts your enemy heroes with their hits and their wounds. But if you want to be a real pain in the backside, you're going to want to use the rune of Surging Gloomtide. And what that does is it summons an extra Gloomtide Shipwreck wholly within 12 inches of the bearer, outside of 3 inches of other things like enemies and terrain. So those body blocking bloody terrain pieces, you could chuck one down and be a royal pain. Now, the Eidolon does have some interesting artifacts to choose from. My personal favorite is probably the Bioshock Shell, and that's going to make an enemy hero within 9 inches strike last if you can beat its bravery on a 3d6. So it's a bit gamey. You're going to have to roll probably high, especially because you're most likely going to want to shut down a hero that has like bravery 10 or at least bravery 9. So, you know, good luck to you. But should that work, I think that's a really interesting artifact for your Eidolon. Now, when it comes to your mount traits and your spell laws, Broken Realms Morathi, which I'm sure you've seen now, it's been out for over a year, introduced mount traits to your Deep Mares and to your Leviathan. So those have been transferred into this book. You probably know them by now, so I'll leave them on screen. And there's some really good options, especially, you know, I've always been a big fan of like Ancient, for example, on the Leviathan. Although the carapace, increasing that void drum, has always been a personal favorite of many people I know as well. But what I wanted to talk more about was going to be the spell choices, and the Idoneth Deepkin spell lore has been simplified down to 4 spells. You've got Steed of Tides, Counter Current, Pressure of the Deep, and Arcane Corrosion. Now, there are some names that are similar to the old book, but they're not a copy and paste. They have been reworded. Arcane Corrosion will still reduce the rend by 1 on that target enemy unit. Pressure of the Deep is still going to auto-slay a model that is within range of the caster when you roll that dice to see if you can beat the wounds characteristic. You attack a Free Guild Guard, it's got 1 wound, you roll a 2+, that model's dead. If you happen to be going for a 5 wound hero, if you roll a 6 because you've beaten the wounds characteristic, that hero would be auto-slain. Obviously, anything that's going to be 6 wounds or more, you can't auto-slain with this spell. Counter Current is going to halve an enemy unit's run and charge rolls, and I think it's a great spell to have up your arsenal. So do look into this one. You know, the game is ultimately a movement-focused game, you know, not necessarily always about combat. So any way to annoy your opponent with reducing run and charge rolls is a good time. And then finally, Steed of Tide is going to give a hero a teleport. So it doesn't have to be the caster, it can just be a friendly hero as long as it's not a monster. and you could use this to teleport to steal an objective, to score a battle tactic, to better support a unit that might need help, or to be in, a certain buff range or things like that. So that's another good one to have up your sleeve. Now, finally, when it comes to your faction abilities, you have the Gloomtide Shipwreck, and it's mostly unchanged from the Warhammer community update. Now, there are some minor updates. The way you deploy it and defensible and all that stuff is still the same. But the changes happened in a rule called the Predators of the Ether Sea. That rule is no longer there. In its place is the Guardians of the Deep. And what the Guardians of the Deep is Idoneth Deepkin units that don't have a mount trait are going to get a 5+ ward save while they are wholly within 6 inches of this terrain feature. If this unit doesn't have the Idoneth Deepkin keyword, then there is no effect on them. So if you remember the old rules, it used to do some mortal wounds. So I think it was if enemy units within 3 inches of the Gloomtide Shipwreck, you used to roll a dice, and if you happen to roll a 6, it would do D3 mortal wounds. That is no longer in effect. So your Gloomtide Shipwreck is not going to hurt your enemy. It is purely a buff piece for yourself to give you a 5+ ward if you are within 6 inches. And to be honest with you, most of my Idoneth opponents have always forgotten about this rule in the thick of the battle. So really, it's probably no loss to be able to do D3 mortal wounds to a unit that's within range of the ship that you roll a 6. But in its place, that 5+ ward bubble is going to be quite tasty for those units that are within 6 inches of the terrain feature, wholly within, and that doesn't have a mount trait. So it's not going to obviously affect your Deep Mare. It's not going to affect your Leviathan. So there's a lot of good updates here for the Idoneth Deepkin, and I would probably say that you have won more than you've lost at this stage. The Tides of Death remains unchanged, but you are going to gain a stronger set of those Ishran rituals. But I'm sure in the comments section, you're going to tell me how much you're going to miss turning off enemy flying. You've unlocked Battle Line, which is a massive win for Idoneth Deepkin players, because I know there's plenty of you who have wanted to run Leviathans and maybe more than one Leviathan in your list. Or if you're someone like my mate Ben Spinetti, who's been an OG Sharks player since first edition, before anyone else was really running Sharks, you're going to love either running Sharks as Battle Line or being able to run the Bloodthirsty Shiver. The command traits and the artifact changes aren't that big for IDK because you had some of the early sub-faction rules, and if you were looking at any other Battletome, let's say Daughters of Cain, or I don't know, insert army here, you would have seen that the sub-factions had your command trait and your artifact tied to the sub-faction. You had missed that boat. So you've still got a lot of flexibility when it comes to command traits and artifacts. And speaking of those sub-factions, there is a lot to like. And depending on if you want to build around eels and sharks and turtles or Namadi, I think there is certainly going to be one that is going to really work for you. And I think there are some interesting rules, but they're not completely overpowered as well. So, and obviously the great thing as well is in the old book, those sub-factions would often, part of its benefit was to influence the narrative battalions that are, no longer really exist in 3rd edition match play. So big boost there. Once this book has received its FAQ, I will definitely be organizing a bunch of IDK players to come on the channel and talk about how the new rules are influencing their list building. And we'll talk a bit about how they're seeing and combining all that good stuff. But until that particular point, let me know in the comment section what you think about the Idoneth Deepkin Allegiance abilities. If you haven't already noticed, there will be a second video that will follow this video, and that will be about things like the War Scroll changes and some of the things like your grand strategies and your battle tactics specific to IDK. So let me know in the comments how this has changed your abilities. What are you most excited about, or what are you most sad to lose? Tell me in the comments, because I'm very curious to hear how you're seeing the new book play out. Thanks for sticking around until the end. I hope you found that video interesting and you walked away with a few new ideas. If you did, I would appreciate it if you hit like on the video, as well as left me a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. The conversation will continue over on Discord, so link is down below in the episode description if you want to join the Discord and continue the Age of Sigmar conversation. I want to give a massive shout out as well to these absolute bloody legends, these champions who have continued to support me through Patreon or YouTube members. That is going directly into supporting the maintenance and the growth of this channel. So thank you very much, guys. Much appreciated. And until next time, roll more sixes.